the triple threat of emotional thinking. Many people are unaware of emotional thinking, and even fewer understand what it actually does and how it impacts upon you. But simply, emotional thinking is making a decision based on feelings rather than a logical, evidence-based approach. A logical, evidence-based approach will result in the right decision being made. A simple example of this, in a non-narcissistic setting, would be you see a red sports car. And that feeling of pride that you would have in driving that car, vanity and looking good in front of other people, the fact that you feel that you deserve that car after having worked hard all year, draws you to decide, yes, I will look really cool in that car. The chicks will dig it. My friends will be envious. The neighbour will appreciate it because he's a car buff. It'll really feel really good to drive it. All of those are feelings. But what's the evidence? What's the logic? Well, it's an expensive vehicle that's not particularly practical for where you live. You already have a good car that's only a year old, and you can't really afford the repayments on this vehicle. Therefore, a logical, evidence-based decision would be don't purchase it. An emotion-based decision is buy it because it feels good. And of course, the person that purchases it 6 months later rues the purchase. I can't really afford this. It's proven more expensive than I realised, and also to maintain. I can't drive certain places because it's so low to the ground. It costs a fortune in fuel. I wish I'd never purchased it. If they had followed an evidence, logic-based approach, they wouldn't have done so. The feeling was misleading and resulted in the wrong outcome. There are, of course, instances where feelings can be relied upon. They serve a purpose. Fear, for example, but even that is exaggerated. And because of the way that we have evolved, the fear that served our ancestors particularly well hasn't really changed much. I, of course, don't experience fear by reason of my psychopathy. However, once upon a time, tens of thousands of years ago, fear developed within humans to keep them alive, to keep Homo sapiens from getting eaten by the saber-toothed tiger, so that the relevant individual didn't go up to it and go, "Ooh, what's this? Hello, nice kitty, puss, puss, puss," only to have their arm ripped off and then get eaten. Fear ensured that Homo sapiens stayed away from the predators because Homo sapiens was the middle of the food chain. It ensured that caution was exercised with regard to the fruit and the berries and the nuts that were eaten to avoid the poisonous ones, that a reliable water source was found, again to avoid illness and poisoning. And fear of those things, of being burned, of being frozen, of being eaten, of being poisoned, drove Homo sapiens to behave in a particular way, which kept the species alive. However, our modern selves have moved at such a pace that, I don't know about the neighbourhood in which you live, but I certainly haven't seen a saber-toothed tiger walking down the middle of the road where I live. Furthermore, our water sources are, for the most part, entirely reliable, provided by utility companies. One goes to the supermarket and doesn't have to worry about the risk of being poisoned. Invariably, the food meets certain standards and regulations, and therefore, unless you're particularly unfortunate that someone has interfered in the process, you're not going to be poisoned by the food that you pick up in the deli or the supermarket. And therefore, there's no need to fear those things. And therefore, our reliance on fear is much reduced because of the modern society in which we live. Of course, there remains things that one should still fear. Somebody points a gun at you, you become frightened because you fear that you'll be shot. Somebody comes at you with a knife. You find yourself stood on the edge of a cliff. Those instances cause fear to occur. But for the most part, fear actually presents itself far more often than it should. And the reason is that the extent of the fear that we experienced all of those thousands of years ago runs at roughly the same level for the majority of the population, and ought to have been reduced by the much safer society that we largely live in. We're no longer the middle of the food chain, we're at the top of it. But our evolved selves haven't caught up with the modernity of the world that we now inhabit and enjoy. And that means that people experience fear more than they should. They hear a strange noise, they're fearful. Why? Because fear serves a purpose. Back on the grassland, a strange noise meant that a predator might be nearby. Now, it's probably just a cat knocking over a dustbin, or an owl hooting in the distance, or a fox crying out at night and sounding like a baby being strangled. Yet elicits fear in many people, but there actually is no reason to fear, and when they understand and realise, they go to the evidence of what is making that noise. They find, what was I getting so frightened about? It's just a cat knocking over the lid of the garbage can. So largely, although feelings do provide a role, they are unreliable, and an evidence-based approach is more appropriate. Emotional thinking occurs in many instances, but within the narcissistic dynamic, it poses a triple threat. Whenever you enter one or more of the 5 arenas of interaction, you suffer a number of downsides. One that you always experience is that you increase your emotional thinking. This is a little bit like getting drunk. It affects your judgment. It makes you make bad decisions, although you invariably don't realise it's a bad decision at the time because you've lost insight. In the same way that you thought it was a good idea after downing 15 tequila slammers to get up on the bar, get your boobs out and sing Hi-Ho Silver Lining at the top of your voice, the next day you rue that activity asking, what on earth possessed me to do what I did? And now the footage is all over the internet. The reason was, at the time, your judgment was impaired by alcohol, and you thought it was a good decision, because otherwise you wouldn't have done it, because you only make decisions that you think are good ones. Emotional thinking operates in the same way. It looks to con you. It looks to con you by causing you to engage in a continued course of interaction with the narcissist, under the auspices of it being something that you think is the right and appropriate thing to do. The triple threat that is posed by emotional thinking is the operation of flawed logic, the corruption of your empathic and narcissistic traits, and what I call charging up the battery of feeling. The operation of flawed logic makes you think you're doing the right thing, but you're not. And invariably you can't see it. And that's where I, as your advisor and expert, are able to point this out to you in objective fashion. And through my work that is contained within the Knowledge Vault, in the Addiction Triple Package, I explain to you various instances of how this manifests so that you can see it and understand it. With regard to the corruption of your empathic and narcissistic traits, it attacks your pride or your honesty, your decency, your compassion, your vanity, your propensity to be argumentative, so that you then take action that keeps you involved with the narcissist. It's important to know which of those traits can be corrupted, and the trait detector determines that for you and gives you clear examples of how that manifests so you can know what to look out for. With the charging up of the battery of feeling, you basically feel a particular way: angry, sad, frustrated, irritated, happy, and so on and so forth. Your emotional thinking causes that emotion to occur so that you act on it. It makes you feel happy, so you continue to interact with the narcissist even though it's actually to your detriment. It makes you feel angry, so you go and confront the narcissist. What have you just done? Given the narcissist fuel, the narcissist has lashed out at you and upset you, you've suffered an adverse consequence, and you've kept your emotional thinking high. And this battery of feeling, you need to drain it, because that's how you feel better. Your feelings of anxiety, fear, anger, frustration, unhappiness, feeling distraught, in pain because of what's happened owing to your interaction with the narcissist, all of that will go if you diminish your emotional thinking. And accordingly, your emotional thinking poses this triple threat. It creates flawed logic, it corrupts your traits, and it charges up your battery of feeling. And those are the 3 conduits to cause you to enter into one or more of the 5 arenas of interaction, and to keep you in those arenas of interaction for as long as possible. Because in so doing, you end up feeding your addiction. And the more that you stay in those arenas and the more that you go in, the more your addiction is fed. And if you are an empath, you have that addiction to the narcissist. And the Addiction Triple Package, which you'll find in the Knowledge Vault, explains where your addiction comes from, what it actually does, and just as importantly, what you can do about it, and is well worth accessing. But it is important to understand that your emotional thinking is the enemy within. You face two battles, keeping us away from you and keeping yourself away from us, and it's often this second battle that is the hardest one. I've witnessed it many, many times in all of my own victims, and of course the many, many people that I advise. And I see how difficult it is for them to conquer it, but it is conquerable. It takes effort, the right tools, which I provide you with, the best tools, which I provide you with, and your own fortitude, and you will succeed. But you need to be aware of this triple threat that emotional thinking poses, because it seeks to hinder your march to freedom and keep you entrenched and locked into the dynamic with the narcissist. I'm H.G. Tudor. Thank you for listening.